All right, welcome back, everyone, and hope you enjoyed that quick break and also that great panel that we just had with Joby, Matt, Rebecca, and Dr. Martin. But we're really excited to close out our two-day conference this year with our closing keynote speaker, Kim Davis, who's the Senior Executive Vice President at the NHL. And right now, I want to welcome on our moderator, Marcus Manning, who's the Executive Director of the Durham Sports Commission. So he should pop up on screen, and going to hand it over to him to lead such a great conversation that we're really looking forward to.
Brian, thank you, and humbled and honored to be here, and looking forward to having a great conversation with Kim Davis. Got some golden nuggets from her yesterday, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Kim, how you doing?
Hi there.
Kim Davis is the Senior Executive Vice President of Social Impact, Growth Initiatives, and Legislative Affairs for the National Hockey League. And Kim, before we dive into our questions, do you just yourself and what you do with the NHL?
Sure. Happy to do that. Camera is acting a little funny, but I think we're all right. So I've been at the NHL for 4 years. I have responsibility for all of the work that we are focused on leading to growing the sport of hockey, particularly with under-indexed audiences. That includes all of our social impact work, all of our youth programming, youth hockey across North America, all of our legislative and policy work, public-private partnerships, our multicultural marketing, and the ways in which we think about building partnerships in communities. So it's quite a portfolio, a really interesting time for us to be talking about the sport of hockey and growing the sport, given the demographic shifts that are occurring across North America.
Thank you for that intro, Kim. And you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
So you have an impressive bio, impressive career to this point, and you spent the majority of your career in corporate America before transitioning to the sports industry. And you've held a lot of different important positions. And so when you think about making that transition, in what ways have you been able to effectively translate your experiences, your skill set, and the knowledge of corporate America into the sports industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and actually talking about over the past 4 years, because as you can imagine, a lot of people are quite curious about the fact of a woman who's never played the sport of hockey, who had no background in sport other than playing tennis in college and in high school, coming into the most senior position that a woman of color has ever held in the sport. And I think the first lesson for all of us is the importance of the transferability of skills. I think we often think that we have to be on these linear paths as it relates to our careers. And I think what I've learned over the 35 years that I've been in business is that as long as you're willing to embrace change, as long as you're willing to be a continuous learner, as long as you're willing to pivot, as long as you're willing to keep an open mind, that you can actually navigate across various industries. The hardest thing is getting people to understand how your skills apply to their industries. And for me, it has been easy because I've been able to articulate the value that I bring to an organization. And that value is that I understand how to interpret the language of different businesses in a way that helps them understand that growth is about change. And so change and culture and being a change agent is the way that I've positioned my personal narrative. And that's allowed me to be able to navigate across different industries.
That's a great point, Kim. And to peel the onion a little bit more here with regard to corporate America, has there been an aspect of the corporate culture that you've seen from a positive standpoint and you've been able to take that to the sports industry?
Yeah. So I was fortunate enough, and I don't think I appreciated just how much this impacted my ability to feel empowered in managing my career. I was fortunate enough to be in financial services and investment banking during a period of tremendous merger and acquisition activity. And so while I was with JP Morgan, started as Chase, started as a small bank that I was with in the late 1980s, and retired from JP Morgan in 2012. So during that entire period, I went through 9 mergers and acquisitions. And when you go through that kind of period of change, you get very comfortable with change, right? You understand that the one thing that we can count on as a constant is change. And so dealing with ambiguity, being able to pivot, understanding how to build relationships, understanding the architecture of organizations and the politics of organizations, all of those are skill sets that I don't even think you realize that you're building when you're going through that kind of change. And I have now found, as a result of that changing industries, going from investment banking, financial services to consulting, and ultimately to sports, what has been constant is my ability to pivot, to deal with ambiguity, and to help people understand that the language of change and growth and business is very consistent, whether you are in one of those industries or another.
Kim, you're starting off hot here, dropping these golden nuggets. Appreciate that. So in an interview with Sports Illustrated last October, one of the things you mentioned was one of the greatest compliments that you can get is having a point of view, right? And so when you think about where we are currently in our country, and then you sort of, you drill down and you think about the sports industry and having a point of view, how does that apply within the world of sports?
Well, for me, having a point of view really has to do with being courageous. And I often talk to leaders as leadership being not having a point of view when the people in the room share your point of view, but holding a point of view when you're dealing with difference. I think that's the hardest thing to be able to do. Because in doing that, you have to have a willingness to suspend judgment. You have to have a willingness to put yourself in the shoes of others. You have to be willing to wrestle with vulnerability. You have to challenge your beliefs within the context of the belief system often that you've grown up with, right? And I think there's a difference between the beliefs that you might hold today and those systems that you grew up with that still exist, right? And that you have to sometimes interrogate. And so it's not easy, but it requires all of us to be courageous if we're going to, lead conversations that allow us to deal with being uncomfortable, which I think ultimately is what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kim, the intersection of sports and community, in my opinion, as a former athletic director, has always been there. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is that it's been elevated into the national spotlight in a lot of different ways. And at the NHL, one of your roles is to oversee and strengthen really the bridge between sports and community, right? What changes have you seen take place within the NHL during your time there?
Well, I think the first thing is that when you want to build relationships with communities or individuals, you have to meet them where they are. And I think one of the things that we have changed the mindset around in the NHL is understanding that in order to build trust with communities, you have to go into those communities. You can't just stand back and say, here we are, and we have this to offer, come get it. You actually have to be vulnerable, go into those communities, build trusted relationships, And that's the way you really build relationships versus having transactions. And I think that's something that we have shifted our mindsets around. Now, having said that, in order to go into communities, in my opinion, and this is what I talk to our owners about all the time, is representation counts. And so when you go into a community, particularly, let's say, a community that's underrepresented in a sport like hockey, those communities are going to trust you when they see people that look like themselves in positions of power and influence. Mm-hmm. And so it's not good enough to just say you have a community agenda or you have a social impact agenda. That has to impact everything that you do, including who you hire and how you hire in your organization in order to achieve those outcomes in that community effort. And so none of these things sit in isolation. That's why we put together a framework that I call the 7 dimensions of excellence and inclusion. And those dimensions start with education, leadership, employment, partnerships, youth participation, marketing, and community and civic engagement. And what it says is that everything relates to everything else. And in order for you to really achieve full inclusion, you have to be pulling on every one of those cylinders. And you need to hold yourselves accountable to improvement in each one of those dimensions.
Kim, I want to come back to that later in the conversation, but I think that's a great point that you just made. When you think about the NHL and technology and being disruptive, how has the NHL at this particular time really leveraged technology in terms of expanding the growth of the league and recent expansion of the partnership with ESPN?
Well, it's ESPN and it's Turner as well, TNT, because as you know, we forged partnerships on both sides. And so with Turner, we brought the opportunity of Bleacher Report, and all of these platforms allow us to speak uniquely to different audiences. One of the smartest decisions that I think Commissioner Bettman made, it happened a year before I joined, 5 years ago, was the hiring of my colleague, who is our chief marketing officer, Heidi Browning. And she came from Silicon Valley, and she worked at Pandora, and she was one of the early trailblazers in the space of social media. And she has brought a whole new discipline to the NHL around understanding youth markets, understanding the use of technology and social media, and the use of research. And that has really changed how we think about growth in the sport. Mm-hmm. And so it was timely for us to forge these partnerships with ESPN and TNT, because everything today is about content, right? How do you build content? How do you exploit content? How do you leverage content? And we are now, I think, on the cutting edge of being able to use technology and to use content and use social media effectively.
So when you think about that, the content, the technology, the social media, and then you think about the intersection of hockey and culture and trying to touch the younger fans, trying to touch the underrepresented fans. How do you see that happening within the NHL?
Yeah, well, for me, and in any job I've ever had in any industry, everything starts with data and research. And so when I joined the league 4 years ago, one of the first things I did was to call an old friend of mine, Dr. Bill Fry at the Brookings Institute. And Bill had been tracking demographic shifts across North America for the past couple of decades. And I asked Bill if he and I could co-author a piece around demographic shifts that he had studied and looking at the implications of those shifts on the sport of hockey. And he and I put a piece together that talked about the fact that 23 of the then 31 NHL markets, this notion of minority was already a misnomer. The majority of growth opportunities in 23 of those markets then in 2018 were going to be with minority communities as was articulated. So we were talking about growth in indigenous, African American, Asian, Hispanic, Latino communities. And so that was important for our owners and our CEOs to hear, because they understood that the imperative was not about charity, it was about growth, right? And that is a really, really important point when you start talking about social impact work, when you start talking about growing in a sport, that you understand social impact is a way for us to appeal to those generational groups for which that is important for them with the brands that they associate with, right? Not as a charitable matter, but as a fandom building matter. And that's the kind of work that we have been undertaking, starting with the data and then using that as a platform for us to be able to articulate the value proposition to those fans and fans in waiting, as we often refer to them.
Kim, you know, we've all gone through the pandemic, and it has impacted every organization, every association, et cetera, in different ways. When you think about your efforts within the NHL, how has the pandemic influenced you or impacted you and your efforts moving forward?
Yeah, well, in many ways, this is an example of that, the positive impact, being able to get the message of our work and the value proposition that we are putting in the market out to broader audiences through like virtual platforms, right, is something that we never would have had the opportunity to do before the pandemic, for sure. It has also allowed us to be able to have many more conversations. I call them getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, having conversations that expand people's awareness and understanding of why this kind of growth strategy is important for the business and the future of a sport like hockey. So as disruptive as the pandemic has been, and Lord knows we know it's been disruptive, in many ways it has created a broader platform and a movement, as I refer to it, as opposed to a moment, for us to really be able to showcase the work and the seriousness of the work that's underway in the National Hockey League.
Kim, speaking of movement, women in sports is something that we've seen, especially over the last 4 to 5 years. We've seen some significant moves in sports at every level. I want to go back to when you were working in corporate America, and you were a leader in corporate America, and you were leading predominantly white men. Talk to us about the challenge and what it took to be in your role and to lead a group of white men in the space that you were in.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing for any of us, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, whatever our intersection is a sense of our own confidence in our own value. And that sense of confidence is something that was instilled in me from a very young age. I had the opportunity to see role models in action. My grandmother, my father's mother, Dr. Rose Butler Brown, was the first African-American woman to get her PhD from Harvard in 1939. My mother got her MBA from the University of Chicago as the first Black woman in 1960. And so these were role models that were accessible to me. And that was a really, really important part of my feeling confident in my competence. So that's number one. Number two is having people around you who affirm that. And I was lucky enough early in my career to have both mentors and sponsors, white men and others in positions of power and influence who nurtured my career. I often draw the distinction between a mentor and a sponsor, a mentor being someone who tells you, and a sponsor is someone who sells you. And I was lucky enough to have those that told me and instructed me and helped me and guided my career. And then I was also fortunate enough to have those that were in positions of power and influence who were willing to use their power and influence to amplify my capabilities and to elevate me. And so that's really important. And thirdly, for me, it was always having the courage to speak and to use my voice in those rooms, and not be concerned because I was the only one. And often I was the only one, the only woman, the only person of color. And it's not to say that's not exhausting sometimes, and it's not challenging. And I will say there have been many times when many microaggressions and macroaggressions were levied my way, but to not allow that to deter you from knowing your worth. And I think that's a really, really important point for all of us, is to know your worth.
Kim, you've been acknowledged and highlighted on several different lists as being one of the most powerful women in sport. And so when a young woman looks at that, and they may look at that and say, I want to get into sports. I want to reach that level, but I don't know how. What advice would you give them?
Well, I have always considered my greatest superpower as being my humility. And I think we have to understand that what is often perceived as glory, there's always a story behind it, right? And I say it that way because I think that when you look at people who have been successful, but particularly women and women of color that have been successful, it's that they've been able to triumph over adversity. And so what I always say to young people and young women is start with the 3 Ps: preparation, passion, and purpose. Preparation is a non-negotiable. You must always be prepared. You have to be a continuous learner. You have to understand that often in your career journey, you're going to have a lot of lateral moves. Everything is not going to be ascension. And there are going to be many roles that you have that aren't things that you love, but they are moves that you must make in order for you to get to the ultimate place of your passion and purpose. Always be clear about your purpose so that you don't compromise your position. And I think that's really been important for me. Integrity is really, really important. And so, there have been moments in my career where my integrity was in question and I had to make a decision about what was I going to stand for. And that's where your purpose comes in. And then passion is important because it keeps you enriched and it keeps you fulfilled as you move along your career journey. That doesn't mean that you're going to be passionate about everything you do, but at some point you have to look at your career and say, am I standing in my purpose and my passion? And if not, what do I need to do to pivot so that I can be on a course that I know I'm going to ultimately feel good about? Because listen, our career journeys typically are pretty long. And for you to keep your energy up during that period, however long it's going to be for you, I think those 3 Ps are really important: preparation, passion, and purpose.
I love that. I love that. We started at a macro level in terms of sports. Let's drill down to the NHL. And in what ways do you feel like the National Hockey League is helping really to change the narrative of the sports industry from male-dominated, closed-minded maybe, to a world that's synonymous with opportunity, equity, and being inclusive?
First of all, it's a journey, it's not an event. And so I want to say that because we still have a lot of work to do. And I think part of being truthful is being vulnerable about the fact that we are not perfect. We're going to continue to do some things that aren't right. There are a lot of things that have to be changed, but we are on a part of a movement that I think there's no turning back. And so I'm excited about that. I think that one of the things that is a real mindset shift, and I heard the previous panelists talk a little bit about this. Often in sport, it's like we have this expectation of athletes. I think the same thing happens with entertainers and celebrities, that we hold them to a different standard. And one of the ways in which we have begun talking to coaches and athletes and general managers in the locker room is for them to understand that the locker room is a workplace. And it is important for us to treat that workplace and the expectations of those that operate in that workplace with the same way we think and treat people that work in the front office or any other part of the organization. I think that's not only good for building a stronger organization and a stronger sport, but I also think it's good for the preparation of those athletes after the afterlife of playing. And the previous panelists talked about this. When you as an athlete are defined by your craft as opposed to defined by your person, and your craft is one of the many skills that you have, then when that craft no longer serves you, you're lost, right? And so it's really important, and it's something that we're spending a lot of time with, building consistency, whether it's in the locker room or in the front office, from the top of the organization all the way down to the grassroots level, talking about what behaviors are acceptable and not acceptable in a workplace culture. That's going to forever change the culture, this hyper masculine culture of hockey and frankly of all sports. It's not just hockey. I think secondly is understanding that the brand of the NHL is impacted by everything that happens in the hockey ecosystem, and we can make all the change in the world at the NHL level, but if we still have kids being called the N-word in grassroots hockey, and if we still have all forms of bullying and harassment and abuse happening at any place in the ecosystem, it's going to impact the brand. And so as the North Star, as the leader of the sport of hockey, it's our responsibility to stand up and to say, this is what should be acceptable across the entire hockey system and influence those other systems. That's work that's underway that is very different than was happening before I joined. And I'm proud to say that has been taken on by all 32 clubs, by the owners and leadership of every one of those clubs.
Kim, that's a great point. And as outsiders, we definitely probably don't think about it in a way of if something happens beyond the NHL, it still has an impact on the NHL.
That's right.
And if you could real quick peel the onion on a lot of layers to it, but just maybe one or two golden nuggets you could share with the audience in terms of a couple of tangible ways that organizations below the NHL can really help elevate the brand of the NHL moving forward.
Yeah. I would say the first thing is making sure that we have a consistent language and a consistent understanding through education and training around what constitutes bad behaviors in our sport and what leadership needs to look like. So we are undertaking one of the largest efforts that's ever been taken in sport. It's an initiative called Respect Hockey. And we are rallying every part of the hockey ecosystem, from the governing bodies at the youth level through the major minor pro leagues all the way up to the NHL, starting with consistent training from the owners all the way down to the most junior person in the organization, in and out of the locker room. We are putting a non-negotiable zero tolerance set of rules in place, a charter, if you will, that every part of the ecosystem is signing and saying that we are going to hold ourselves and hold each other accountable to. We're providing resources to the non-NHL hockey communities to help them understand how to talk about and train their people on culture. So it's a monstrous undertaking, and it's not going to happen overnight. But the fact that we are building this consistency at the college hockey level, at the AHL level, at the USA hockey level, that is going to be, this is not evolutionary change. This is revolutionary change for a sport like hockey. And that's the effort that's underway.
And one of the things we've also seen over the past couple years are athletes at every level, high school, college, and professional, using their platforms to advocate for racial and social justice. And so we're seeing it in the rinks across the country. And so when you think about that, how would you quantify the effect that marketing has had on diversity and inclusion efforts in the NHL with athletes in the NHL, really again using their platforms for this type of message?
Yeah. Well, listen, in our sport, the fact of the matter is 96% of our players are white. 32% of that 96% are from outside the United States. And so instead of running away from the fact that we are a majority white organization, in my opinion, and what we've talked about is that we need to lean into inclusion and diversity as a potential strength. The fact of the matter is we can become a standard bearer for inclusion within the world of sports by creating allyship in a way that helps people understand how to operate and work together. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've been leaning into. And that starts by recognizing and honoring people's differences. So for example, today, the Player Tribune just published an article done by one of our players, Madison Bowie. And those that are listening to this, please go and check it out because it is one of the most powerfully penned articles. And the name of the article is Hockey Has Always Been Black. And Madison, who played on the Washington Capitals team when they won the Stanley Cup in 2019, he is now with the Vancouver Canucks, talked about his experience growing up in hockey and how his father, who was a Black man who played with hockey in Germany, affirmed him in hockey early by letting him know and telling him and teaching him about the trailblazers that existed in the sport that looked like him. And I think, Spike Lee often says that if you don't control the narrative around your own, if you don't control your own narrative, that others will tell your story and they probably won't tell the story right. And so, hockey has a rich history of Blacks in it dating back to the late 1800s. Nobody knows about that because we haven't told that story. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of what inclusion means in a sport like hockey, is telling the stories of the history of Indigenous players and Asian players and Black players. And I think that's the real work that we're leaning into and really working hard every day to change people's perceptions and the flashcards that they have that hockey is a white man's sport, and it's just not true.
When you think about the constant messaging of the awareness of racial and social justice and athletes using their platform, if you can share with the audience maybe one or two positives that you've seen because of this happening, but then also maybe one or two negatives that you've seen as well. Yeah.
So, again, in a sport like hockey, where, of our 800 or so players, 50 so are of color and 30 are on an active roster. Even though that number is much larger than most people think, when people ask me how many players are in Black players are in hockey, for example, and I say, well, how many do you think? And they say like 3. And I'm like, no, it's actually 10 times that. And the pipeline coming up through the ECHL and the AHL, which are the feeder systems, is very robust. And so that, again, controlling that narrative is really important. So Ryan Reeves, who now plays for the New York Rangers, who right during the pandemic played for the Las Vegas Golden Knights, actually led the effort in the wake of George Floyd's murder and rallied his white brethren to decide not to play that August when the verdict about George Floyd's murder was coming out. And of course, everyone was saying that the league should make the decision about not playing that game and all of that. But in every other sport where there are majority Black and brown players, those players, the greatest social platform that you can have in sport is the player's voice. And so just the fact that we had players of color in the sport of hockey leading that effort, that is such a major sign of progress in our sport, and it can't be underestimated or undermined. So that's an important example of positivity. An example of negativity is the fact that most recently in both the American Hockey League and the ECHL, we had incidents of racial taunts as recently as a month ago. And to think that those things are currently happening and still happening is disappointing. What I would say was positive about the outcomes of those issues is because we have had a player inclusion committee in place for the last couple of years, both current and former players actively consulting with the league on how to make sure we create a stronger, more welcoming environment. That group got involved in those incidents and actually created these learning opportunities for those players that were the perpetrators that will forever change them, number one, and will make them leaders in the locker room in the future. And that's the behavioral change that we want, right? Understanding that in a sport like hockey, that's what's going to happen in order for us to make the kind of progress we need to make.
It's a great point, Kim. One of the other things that we've seen happen in the last couple of years is the uptick in organizations within sport, within corporate America, of diversity and inclusion programming. And we've seen an uptick in the hiring of chief diversity officers. Within sport, we've seen coaches and staff members in some forms question the validity of diversity and inclusion within their sport. And when you think about that and how these programs are being implemented, what are some ways where you can make sure that there is tangible evidence that no matter the group, that there is significant effort and intention in terms of really trying to make change?
Yeah. I think that, I talked earlier about one of the ways in which I've been able to pivot my career and be successful across different industries is to be able to understand and relate to and speak the language of the environments that I'm in. And that, I think, has been something that I've come to do effectively in the sport of hockey. And so, when you are thinking about and talking about and to coaches and general managers in the locker room, we have to understand a couple of things. We have to understand, for the most part, those folks have grown up and have excelled to the places that they're in because they were athletes, not because they were culture experts, business folks. That's not why they are there. That's not how they got there. And so in saying that, you have to appeal to the things that are going to appeal to them. For a coach and general manager, the most important thing for them is keeping their jobs, not getting fired, right, based on performance, and two, their personal brands, right, which ultimately leads to performance. And the fact of the matter is, as locker rooms get more diverse, and as sports get more diverse, this becomes an important skill for them to have. Not just around diversity and inclusion, but the ways in which they relate and talk to athletes, because the expectations of the athlete of today as a Gen Zer and a millennial is very different than the athlete of 20 years ago. And so they have to build some new skills that maybe they didn't have to have, and maybe they didn't have to think about maybe when they were playing that sport. And so I think you have to appeal to that part of an individual, as opposed to speaking a language that they don't really understand, right? And that they may have a flashcard for that is an old and outdated model. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, that's something, if you are a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old, the way you think about that is not necessarily current and fresh. So I think we have to put more thought into how we are appealing, and it takes more time, right? But if we did this well in any industry, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So nobody's licked it, nobody's killing it. And so if you want a different outcome, you probably have to have a different input. And I think we have to start thinking differently about how we are talking about these issues. And again, for me, it's about growth as opposed to charity. It's about winning. How do you build a high performing team? You do that because everybody feels like they can bring their authentic selves. If people aren't being authentic, they aren't going to perform at their best. So using language that helps people relate to the things that matter to them are the ways in which we're going to have new conversations in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my opinion.
That's great, Kim. We are going to transition. We have some questions rolling in from the audience. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. The Hockey for Everyone movement, sponsored by the NHL, it speaks to different socioeconomic statuses. One of the things that we see happening is the cost of participation.
Yeah.
And in hockey specifically, the price of hockey equipment can be a barrier for some groups.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that, what can the NHL do in terms of really addressing that equipment that you have Nike and Bauer and others manufacture?
Yeah. So look, in any field, in investment banking, we talk about diversification of your portfolio. In sport, we need to take those same concepts and talk about that in terms of diversification of the on-ramps and the off-ramps that you provide youth in order to consume the game, to play the game, and to ultimately become fans of the sport, knowing that most kids that are going to pick up a hockey stick aren't ever going to be professional hockey players, but we want them to be fans of the sport. And so for me, it means, one, making sure that we continue to provide investment dollars to subsidize programming, so that where we see kids learning to skate, learning to play, and being able to move into higher levels of hockey, and we know how expensive it is, not just for hockey, by the way, for all sports, because sport has become privatized. And so it's very expensive when you start talking about travel teams and so forth. I have affluent friends who complain about the $15,000, $16,000 that they spend on lacrosse and soccer and baseball. So this is a broader issue, but being able to subsidize that in ways that really support kids being able to navigate, number one. Number two is, we've just launched and piloting a new street hockey product that will allow kids to be able to consume the sport, inexpensive, easy to access, don't have to have ice or infrastructure, and make it cool and entertaining and connected with music and food and culture in a way that gets kids interested in the sport of hockey, connected in communities, and wanting to follow a particular team. Because we're going to be using the marks of all 32 teams across the entire country. And so that's diversification. You're thinking about new and different ways for us to appeal to kids, esports, all of the different ways in which we need to be bringing a consumable opportunity. to kids and thinking of them as future fans as opposed to just kids that want to play the sport are all the ways in which we're innovating and thinking around the sport of hockey today.
Kim, I want to come back to, you mentioned esports, but I have another question from the audience, but I do want to come back to esports after that if we have time.
Okay.
We mentioned earlier giving advice to young women that want to break into the world of sport. Drilling down, this specific question is, what advice do you have for Black women entering the sports business world?
Yeah. It really goes back to those concepts that I talked about in terms of knowing your value, knowing your worth, being prepared, understanding that you got to grind it out early in your career. There's no substitute for grinding it out. And I can tell you, I grinded it out for a long time. Look at the models of women of color that have entered sport over the past 5 years that have come from other industries. Myself, Cynthia Marshall, Daisha Smith with the NFL, China Jude, who is with the Broncos, Michelle Meyer-Shipp, who was with MLB, is now transitioned over as the CEO of Dress for Success. There are so many role models and examples of excellence. Reach out to people. You know, I'm very accessible on LinkedIn. My office probably thinks I spend too much time, mentoring folks, but I believe that you have to pay it forward and encourage people. People encouraged me, and so don't be afraid to ask people to give you a couple of gems of advice. Don't ask people for an hour of their time, but if you ask somebody for 15 minutes, and if it's interesting enough, it'll go to 30 minutes. That's an extra special, nugget. So yeah, back to those 3 Ps and understanding that early in your career, you got to grind it out.
Kim, real quick, going back to esports, for the NFL, Madden has been so successful and has been an entry point to a lot of casual fans to the NFL.
Yes.
So when you think about that and what the NHL could do, have there been some ways to really take advantage of that space moving forward?
Yeah, we're getting much better there, and we have so much more that we can do in the space. Just this past year, eSport enhanced its female personas to replicate women hockey players, knowing and understanding that today 40% of our current fan base in the NHL are women. And we have not capitalized on that. We have not capitalized on the fact that women of color are one of the fastest growing segments of growth within the sport of hockey. The Black Girl Hockey Club that came into existence 3 years ago has really amplified and affirmed women of color who are interested and have been consumers of the sport to bring their voices to the table. So yeah, eSport, we have so much more we can do. We think we're making progress, but just personas in the eSport space that represent those growing demographics is one of the things we're spending a lot of time working on.
Kim, we touched on this yesterday a little bit, but what excites you the most, if you could share with the audience, what excites you the most about the future of the NHL, especially in your space?
What excites me the most is that people are beginning to understand the growth imperative and the opportunities that exist in a sport like hockey for kids that have otherwise not felt that it was a sport for them. And that has come as a result of our amplifying things that are true about the sport that no one ever knew about. And so I'm excited to be part of that effort. I'm excited that the NHL is willing to interrogate itself and to take the methodical approach, not the quick, easy answer that doesn't result in real sustainable change, but really plow through the real work that's required to truly change culture. And that means doing things like going deep with training and having conversations that are extremely uncomfortable, and pivoting when we don't get it right, and doing all of the things that are necessary in order for us to grow long term. I don't expect us to see radical change in the next 2 to 3 years, but if we stay this course, we will see radical change in a sport like hockey in the next decade. And that's what keeps me excited about being part of this effort.
I love it. I love it. And we have a few more minutes here. So I have a couple more questions. When you look at the map of the United States and the potential in different regions, do you see one or two regions within the United States that you feel like the growth of hockey can really take off in terms of exponential growth from a fan base standpoint?
Yeah. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity across all 32 clubs, but I think we have particularly exciting opportunities in those regions where people don't have preconceived notions about how hockey should be consumed. Mm-hmm. And those typically are those new markets where we've seen hockey explode over the past decade, in Texas, in Arizona, in Southern California, in Florida, in North Carolina, in Nashville, in Seattle. Those places where they didn't have to rewrite a perception or a flashcard, if you will, that existed about the sport, but there's an opportunity to build upon what we've known to be true and what we've learned to be true, and to really capitalize on that. And I think that those markets see the opportunities. They know the demographics are playing in their favor. They are being intentional and authentic about how they're engaging in their outreach to new markets. And I think you're going to see a lot of growth in those places.
Kim, as we wrap up, in two-part question, when you think about low-hanging fruit that's out there, and in terms of what you would call success within the next year, what would that be from your lens? And then the second part of that question is long-term success. So 2 to 3 years out, mm-hmm. What would be considered success from your lens?
So short-term low-hanging fruit for me is the fact that we are in the midst of being able to reimagine for people what the brand of hockey looks like. Mm-hmm. And the immediate results of that are showing up in terms of the kind of talent and the diverse talent that we see interested in working in the sport of hockey. Over the past 18 months, the kind of talent that we have seen interested in our sport is completely different than what we have historically seen. And that is really exciting and encouraging to me. In terms of medium-term opportunity, I think the fact that we are creating all of these on-ramps and these opportunities to create more consistency across the entire ecosystem, from youth all the way up to professional, mm-hmm. I think you're going to start seeing the image and the brand of the sport show up in tangible ways. Less noise about hockey being a racist sport, and the N-word used, or homophobia, and all of these isms that hockey has become known for. I think there is a quieting of that because of the work that is underway. That's not sexy work. That's not work that the media wants to pick up. But for me, that's the real work. And I think that that's going to, again, change how the brand is perceived, and it's going to change how people want to consume. And then long-term, again, the demographics are our guiding light. If we're going to grow our sport, we're going to have to embrace audiences that historically haven't felt that this sport was for them. And we have to do that with authenticity. We have to do that with savoir-faire. We have to do that in a culturally available way. And that's going to be the test that we will measure ourselves against, and the accountability that we will hold ourselves to.
Kim, I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us. Tons of information, tons of golden nuggets. I just want to thank you for taking time, for spending time with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcus and Kim as well. This has been a great conversation, and really interested to see where the NHL moves forward with all these initiatives that have been going on. And it's just incredible to see the work that you are doing at such a high level to continue to bring change in an organization that is really impressive and continues to grow. So really appreciative of all the things that you shared with us today, and looking forward to seeing where things continue to grow and staying in touch with everything that you're doing across the league and even outside of the league as well. It's incredible the work that you do. And likewise, Marcus, the work that you're doing here in the Durham community in this local grassroots area is amazing, and really appreciative of both of you taking the time to come out tonight and share your experiences. It's been great.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. And thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Marcus.
All right.
Absolutely. And before we close out the event tonight, I'd like to welcome both Blake Clark and Alexis Williamson to come on to the backstage, as we wanted to close out and have some parting words for the event that we've been able to host over the last 2 days. And first off, really want to thank all of the speakers that came out to our event over these last 2 days, all the insightful advice that they gave us about breaking into the industry, as well as all of just the notes and nuggets in terms of how to be engaged with everything that goes on and the different opportunities that are out there. I'm hopeful that a lot of the students were able to take away something really insightful and really important from all of the conversations that we've been able to host over these last 48 hours. I'd also like to thank ESPN for their continued support over our partnership, and continuing to grow on that as we continue to build out our initiative and all the different opportunities that exist between the two of us, as well as Jamie Bird and the entire staff at the Career Center for facilitating our inaugural sports networking fair earlier today. Once again, I hope the students that were able to attend were able to really get a good experience from that initiative, and we're looking forward to continue to having similar initiatives like that moving forward. And finally, I'd also like to give a major shout out to our entire DSBC student team, including the students that are here in the room with us today that have facilitated all the backstage logistics going on in terms of the Zoom and everything else that's happened over these last 2 days. And most importantly, our alumni and departmental advisory boards have really been there to support us over our last year, really building out this initiative on Duke's campus.
We would finally like to thank all of the departmental and student organizations at Duke who helped this event come together, including Student Affairs, the Office of Undergraduate Education, Duke Athletics, the Alumni Association, Duke's Fuqua School of Business, DMIN, University Communications, the MMS program and I&E departments, Duke Punta University, and so many others. We would not be here tonight without all of your guidance and support.
And before leaving tonight, we'd like to now announce the winners of this year's giveaways. So the winners for the suite of gift cards to Yoga Off East, the Durham Food Hall, and Dame's Chicken and Waffles are Stephen Lee, Sophia Cabret, and Alex Yurga. I recommend everyone tries out those food places. They're very good as well. The winner of the Coach K signed copy of Coach K, the King of Cameron, as well as 2 tickets to Countdown to Craziness 2022 is Ani Echeverria. We will be reaching out to confirm and share next steps with you all. With all of that, we'd like to wish everyone a great weekend, and thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure to stay up to date by following us on social media at DSB Conference on Instagram and Twitter, and find us on other social media platforms as well as our website. As we'll be launching new initiatives, and we'll host more events throughout the remainder of the semester and moving forward. Hope to see everyone soon.